The rain came down in sheets over Michigan Avenue, turning the sidewalks into rivers and sending tourists scrambling for awnings and revolving doors. Chicago in October had a particular kind of cold that didn't just touch your skin, it went straight through your coat and settled in your bones. Most people quickened their steps, pulled their collars tighter, and kept their eyes forward, the way city people always do when they don't want to see something uncomfortable. But Margaret Holloway, seated in the back of her black Cadillac Escalade, had spent 78 years training herself to see exactly what other people chose to ignore. The man on the bench wasn't begging. That was the first thing she noticed. He sat with his back straight the way people sit when they've spent years being told posture matters. His jacket was army green, worn thin at the elbows, with a patch on the shoulder that had faded to near illegibility. His boots were cracked but tied. His hands rested on a duffel bag in his lap, and his eyes were closed. Not sleeping, she thought, just conserving something. Warmth, maybe, or dignity. "Mr. Caldwell," she said without taking her eyes off the man, "stop the car." Her assistant, seated beside her, looked up from his phone. "Mrs. Holloway, we're already 7 minutes behind for the—" "Stop the car." The Escalade pulled to the curb in front of the Grand Windsor Chicago, the flagship property of Holloway Hospitality Group, 42 hotels across 16 states, a brand that had been on the cover of Forbes 3 times in the last decade. The hotel's canopy extended over the front entrance, with polished brass fixtures and 2 doormen in tailored wool coats. The lobby beyond the glass doors was visible from the street. Warm amber light, a flower arrangement that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Guests in business attire moving with the purposeful calm of people who had never sat on a cold bench in the rain. Margaret watched the man on the bench. He hadn't moved. A couple walked past him without slowing. A woman in a fur-lined hood steered her daughter deliberately to the other side of the entrance walkway. She pressed the intercom button on the divider. "Call down to security. Tell them there's a man sitting on the bench near the front steps. Tell them to remove him." The driver acknowledged. Margaret reached for her phone. Then she stopped. The man had shifted slightly on the bench, and as he did, something fell from the outside pocket of his jacket. It hit the wet sidewalk and bounced once. He didn't seem to notice. He reached into his pocket for something else, a folded piece of paper, a photograph she couldn't tell, and looked at it for a long moment before tucking it away again. The thing that had fallen was small and round, and caught the light from the hotel entrance even through the rain. Margaret Holloway had been 8 years old when the Millbrook Road School bus accident happened in rural Indiana. She remembered it the way people remember things they witnessed through a television screen. The image burned into memory, not because they were there, but because the world stopped for 3 days while 64 adults held their breath for 85 children. She remembered the photograph on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, the one her mother had left on the kitchen table. A man in military uniform, carrying a child through smoke so thick you could barely see his face. The child's arm was around his neck. His other arm was reaching back toward the wreckage. She remembered the medal. She had seen it on the news. She had seen it when they showed the ceremony at the White House. She was 12 by then, and she had watched the whole broadcast, sitting on the floor in front of the television, because something about the man receiving it made her feel that she should stand up straight and pay attention. She had not thought about that medal in perhaps 40 years. It was lying on the wet sidewalk outside her hotel. "Cancel the security call," she said. She got out of the car. His name was Thomas Garrett, and he looked at her the way people look at someone they expect to be asked to leave. He was somewhere in his 70s, with close-cropped white hair and the kind of face that had spent decades outdoors, deeply lined, weathered, but somehow still composed. His eyes were dark brown and entirely clear, no confusion in them, no apology, just patience, the exhausted kind that comes from having explained yourself too many times to people who weren't really listening. Margaret held the medal out to him. "You dropped this." He looked at her hand, then at her face. He took the medal without reaching for it desperately the way she expected. He took it carefully, like it was fragile, and closed his fingers around it. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low and even. She stood in the rain for a moment longer than made any sense. Her assistant was hovering behind her with an umbrella. One of the doormen had materialized at the edge of the canopy, trying to determine whether he should intervene. "You saved 85 children," she said. It wasn't a question. She was certain enough that it didn't need to be. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked away, down the street, the way people do when they're deciding how much of themselves to give to a conversation they didn't ask for. "I was there," he said. "The children saved themselves, mostly. They were just kids. They did what they were told." "You went into a burning bus 3 times. The 3rd time wasn't necessary," he said, and something in his expression shifted. The ghost of something old, not regret exactly, but the weight of a memory he'd carried long enough that it had started to reshape the way he held his shoulders. "The last girl, she'd already gotten herself to a window. I just helped her down." Margaret Holloway had built a business empire by reading rooms and reading people, by understanding what someone needed before they said it, and giving it to them in a way that made them feel like it had always been there. She had negotiated with developers who tried to ruin her. She had outmaneuvered competitors who underestimated her. She had sat across boardroom tables from men who expected her to defer, and she had not deferred. She had not felt uncertain in a very long time. She felt uncertain now. "Come inside," she said. "Out of the rain." He didn't want to come inside. It took her 3 minutes and 2 direct refusals before he agreed, and only because she told him flatly that she was the owner of the hotel and that if he refused, she would simply bring chairs out to the sidewalk, and they would have the conversation in the rain, which she was prepared to do, and which would look considerably stranger than him coming inside. He almost smiled at that. Not quite. Inside, she took him to a private lounge off the main lobby, a room used for contract signings and quiet meetings with investors. Her assistant brought coffee and a plate of food that Thomas looked at for a moment before beginning to eat with the careful restraint of someone who had been hungry for long enough that he'd learned not to rush. She waited until he'd eaten half the food before she asked him anything. "How long have you been in Chicago?" 3 weeks. And before that, a pause. "Indianapolis, before that Louisville. I move when I need to." "Are you looking for something?" He looked at her directly. His hands were wrapped around the coffee mug and they were steady. "My daughter." Margaret Holloway set her own cup down. "Tell me." Her name was Diane. She was 41 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, which Thomas said with something that was almost a laugh, a small, compressed sound that acknowledged humor the way a man who's been alone a long time will acknowledge it, quietly, mostly to himself. Diane's mother, Carol, had died of ovarian cancer 11 years ago. The diagnosis came fast and the treatment came slower, and the bills arrived faster than either. Thomas had been retired by then, medically, after a knee injury during a training exercise that had never healed correctly. His pension covered the basics. The medical bills did not fall under the category of basics. He had sold the house in Fort Wayne. He had liquidated the retirement savings he'd managed to accumulate. He had worked 3 jobs for 2 years while Carol was in treatment, driving for a delivery company at night, doing security work on weekends, and taking whatever handyman work he could find in the hours between. Carol had told him to stop, that it was too much, that they should accept the help being offered. Various veterans organizations had reached out after the Millbrook Road anniversary coverage. A publishing house had offered a significant advance for his story. A cable news network had inquired about a documentary. Thomas had turned them all down. He told Margaret this without embarrassment, without any apparent expectation of being argued with. It was simply how things were. The children at Millbrook Road had been someone else's children, and he had done what he did because there was no other option a human being with a working conscience could have chosen in that moment. He had not gone into a burning bus to become a television interview. He was not going to start treating that day as a commodity 40 years after the fact, when it could benefit him, but not the families who had actually lived through it. Margaret said nothing for a moment. Then, after Carol passed? After Carol passed, Diane had stayed close for a year. She was working in accounting in Indianapolis, had built a decent life, had a boyfriend Thomas had reservations about, but kept largely to himself. Then the boyfriend's business started having problems, legal problems, the kind that compound. There were investigations into financial irregularities at an investment firm where the boyfriend, whose name was Marcus Deal, had been a mid-level manager. Diane, by this point, had done contract accounting work for the same firm. Thomas had told her to hire a lawyer immediately. She had told him she had nothing to worry about, that Marcus had assured her her name wasn't connected to anything. Marcus Deal had, in fact, connected her name to several things. When federal investigators came to Diane's apartment looking for records, Marcus had already left the state. What they found instead was Diane's laptop, which contained files she later said she had never opened, and a paper trail that had been partially constructed to run through her professional identity. The charges were eventually reduced after 2 years of legal proceedings, and Diane was not convicted of anything. But the legal bills consumed everything she had left. Her professional license was suspended pending review, and by the time the case concluded, she had lost her apartment, her savings, and the boyfriend, who had been found in Arizona and was facing entirely separate and considerably more serious federal charges. What Thomas hadn't expected was that she would also lose herself. He said this quietly. He said it the way fathers say things about daughters when the truth is too complicated for a single sentence. After the legal proceedings, Diane had gone somewhere he couldn't follow. She wasn't unreachable in the geographic sense. She called sometimes, sent texts that were cheerful in a way that told him nothing, but she had stopped letting him in. She had stopped accepting help. She had moved twice without telling him her new addresses until he asked directly. She had started making choices he didn't understand. He heard through a mutual friend that she had started spending time with people connected to the same network Marcus Deal had come from. Not legally, nobody was breaking laws, as far as Thomas could determine, but the kind of people who existed in the margins of legitimate things, who moved money in ways that were technically permissible, but didn't bear looking at too closely. Thomas had driven to Indianapolis. She wasn't there. He had tried Louisville, where someone thought she'd gone, then Cincinnati, then Chicago, where a woman who'd known Diane in Indianapolis thought she'd seen her 3 months ago near the Pilsen neighborhood. He had been looking for 8 months. Margaret Holloway didn't sleep that night. She lay in the private suite she kept at the Grand Windsor, for nights when she worked too late to go home, and she stared at the ceiling, and she did what she had always done when a problem refused to sit still in her mind. She broke it apart and looked at each piece. She had known men like Thomas Garrett. Not many, but a few. Men who had a quality she could never fully articulate, not just integrity. Everyone talked about integrity, but a kind of structural solidity, as though they'd been built around a core of something that didn't bend. Her father had had it. Her father had been a maintenance worker who raised 3 daughters in a 2-bedroom apartment in Evanston, and had never once suggested that any of them should want less than everything. He had died the year she opened her 3rd hotel, and she had wished every day since that he'd lived to see the 14th or the 22nd, or the lobby of the Chicago flagship with its amber light and its impossible flowers. Her father had never met Thomas Garrett, but she thought he would have recognized him immediately. She also thought about the other thing, the thing she hadn't mentioned to Thomas because she wasn't entirely sure it was real, and she needed to check before she said anything. She'd told her assistant to pull the Millbrook Road file, everything, every newspaper clipping, every broadcast record, every public document. She had a reason that she wasn't ready to say out loud yet, even to herself. At 2:17 in the morning, she found it. The Indianapolis Star, November 1987. A follow-up piece on Thomas Garrett, published 3 years after the accident, when a local reporter had tracked him to Fort Wayne and written a profile of his life since the rescue. The article included several photographs. One of them showed Thomas and Carol at their kitchen table, and in the background, barely visible on a shelf, was a small framed photograph of a building. The building was the Lakeside Motor Inn, South Bend, Indiana. Margaret's father had managed that motel for 11 years. She had spent every summer of her childhood there, running the walkways between rooms and eating vending machine crackers for lunch and doing her homework on the front counter while her father worked the desk. The photograph in Thomas's kitchen was taken because the Lakeside Motor Inn was where Thomas and Carol had stayed on their first weekend trip together. The article mentioned this, a detail she had skimmed past the first time. The motel manager, it said, had given them a discounted room because the motel was nearly empty, and it was raining, and Carol had admired a watercolor print in the lobby. Her father's name was Gerald Holloway. He had given discounted rooms to young couples in the rain approximately as often as it rained. She was not going to tell Thomas this tonight. It would sound like something fabricated, and she didn't have time for it to sound like anything other than the truth. She needed to find Diane first. She picked up her phone. It took Margaret's team 4 days. She had resources that Thomas didn't, not because she was smarter or more determined, but because she had spent 30 years building a network that extended into every layer of Chicago's professional world and several cities beyond it. Her VP of operations had a contact at a property management company in Pilsen. That contact knew someone who managed a building on West 18th Street where a woman matching Diane's description had signed a month-to-month lease 6 weeks ago. Margaret's assistant confirmed the address against a photograph Thomas had shown her on his phone. Diane at a family Christmas 3 years before, smiling at the camera with the slightly distant expression of someone who is present in a photograph but somewhere else in her mind. She told Thomas on a Thursday morning in the same private lounge. He sat very still for a moment. Then he asked if she was certain. She told him she was reasonably certain, and that she thought he should go alone first, and that he should not expect it to go easily. He said he didn't expect anything to go easily anymore. He said this without bitterness, which was somehow the most difficult thing she'd heard all week. She gave him cab fare and the address on a note card, and she watched him walk through the lobby and out through the revolving doors, straight-backed, steady-footed, carrying his worn duffel bag. She didn't hear from him for 36 hours. Diane Garrett opened the door of her apartment on West 18th Street and looked at her father for a long moment without speaking. She was thinner than the photograph. She had Carol's eyes, which was what Thomas always noticed first, and which always required him a second to get past. She was wearing a sweatshirt from a university she had never attended, and her hair was pulled back in a way that looked like she'd done it that morning, without looking in a mirror. "Dad," she said. "Hi, sweetheart." She held the door half open. Behind her the apartment was small and clean. She'd always been neat, even as a teenager, with a folding table that served as a desk and stacks of folders arranged with the particular organization of someone who spends a lot of time with paperwork. "How did you—" "A woman helped me find you." Diane looked at him. "What woman?" "Her name is Margaret Holloway. She owns the Grand Windsor Hotel." A long pause. "Why would she help you?" Thomas thought about this. "I'm not entirely sure yet," he said honestly, "but she did." He didn't push to come in. He stood in the doorway and let her decide, and she looked at him for a moment, the way she'd been looking at people for the last several years, assessing the weight of letting someone close enough to see where she actually was. And then she stepped back and held the door open. He came in. He sat down at her kitchen table, which was the kitchen table from Carol's house in Fort Wayne, the one she had insisted on keeping when everything else went. She made coffee. He didn't say anything about her being thin, or about the 8 months, or about Marcus' deal, because those conversations had places, and this wasn't the place for any of them yet. He said, "How are you doing?" She sat down across from him and wrapped her hands around her mug and looked at the table. "Better than I was," she said. "Not as good as I should be." "That's honest." "I've been trying to be more honest." A pause. "The people in the network after Marcus, I got out of that about 2 months ago. I know I was making bad choices. I know it looked like I was just making the same mistake in a different direction, and She stopped. "I didn't know how to ask for help. After everything that happened with the case, I felt like I'd made such a mess that I didn't deserve." "Stop," he said. She looked up. "You're my daughter," he said. "That sentence doesn't have a condition on the end of it." She put her face in her hands. She didn't cry the way people cry in movies. It was quieter than that, more exhausted, the kind of crying that comes after you've been holding something for so long that your arms have given out. He put his hand on top of hers and waited. Margaret Holloway received a text from an unknown number at 11:43 that night. "She's okay. We talked for 6 hours. She's trying to get her accounting license reinstated, thank you." She set her phone down on her desk and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office on the 14th floor. The lights of Chicago spread out below her like a second galaxy, the lake invisible in the dark beyond the city's edge. She had been in this office for 21 years. She had made decisions here that shaped thousands of jobs and hundreds of millions of dollars in value, and one brand that had become synonymous with a particular kind of American excellence, the earned kind, not the inherited kind. She had walked away from deals that didn't feel right and toward deals that terrified her, and through every crisis that a hotel business could generate, from recessions to pandemics to fires to the specific category of reputational disaster that only the hospitality industry can create. She had rarely done anything in this office that felt as straightforwardly good as the thing she had done this week. She didn't examine that too closely. There was still more to do. The story broke on a Saturday. She hadn't intended it to break. She had mentioned Thomas's situation to no one outside her immediate team, 3 people she trusted with the kind of information that could become a news story if it reached the wrong ears. But Chicago is a city, and cities have people in them, and one of the hotel staff had recognized Thomas from his brief passage through the lobby during the week he'd spent occupying a corner of the private lounge while Margaret's team worked. That staff member had mentioned it to a cousin who worked for a local television news segment, and by Saturday morning there was a crew outside the Grand Windsor and a reporter doing a stand-up on the sidewalk near the bench where Thomas had been sitting when Margaret's car pulled up. Margaret saw it on her phone at 6:42 in the morning and called her head of communications before she'd finished reading the segment transcript. How much do they have? The basic outline. Veteran, Millbrook Road, homeless in Chicago, hotel owner steps in. They don't have his current location or anything about the daughter. Keep it that way. She thought for a moment. Get Thomas on the phone. He needs to know this is happening before he sees it somewhere. Thomas's reaction when she reached him was silence. Then, I didn't want this. I know, I'm sorry. I don't think we can stop it now, but I want you to know that I won't participate in anything you don't authorize. No interviews, no statements from my side. This is your life. You make the decisions about it. Another silence. My daughter. I will protect her information completely. I give you my word. He asked her what she thought he should do. She told him what she actually thought, which was that the story was going to grow regardless of what either of them wanted, and that the only question was whether he was in control of how it was told or whether someone else was. She told him that meant he would probably need to make a decision about whether to speak publicly, and that she would support whatever he chose, and that either way, she was going to need him to come to the hotel. He came. Within 48 hours, the story had reached the national networks. It was the medal that did it, the photograph of Thomas's bronze star, obtained from old wire service archives and published alongside his army service record. The image was striking. A young Thomas Garrett in uniform, 29 years old, the award around his neck at the Pentagon ceremony, and beside it, a current photograph taken by a Tribune photographer outside the Grand Windsor of a 73-year-old man who looked at the camera with the same direct, uncomplicated gaze he'd had at 29. The Millbrook Road children, adults now in their 40s and 50s, began responding publicly within hours of the national pickup. Social media, which didn't exist when Thomas saved them, became the medium through which a generation of people who had walked through fire as children began reaching back toward the man who had carried them out of it. Margaret watched it from her office. She watched it with the complicated feeling of someone who has put a mechanism in motion and is only now understanding the full scale of what that mechanism is. A woman in Columbus, Ohio, posted a photograph of herself at her daughter's college graduation with the caption, "This graduation photo exists because of Thomas Garrett. My daughter exists because of Thomas Garrett. We've been trying to find him for 30 years. Please share." It was shared 400,000 times in 18 hours. A man in Atlanta posted a video of himself talking about the accident. He'd been 7 years old, had spent 3 days in a burn unit before being released, had gone on to become an emergency room physician. He said, looking directly at his phone camera, that he had asked himself on the worst nights of his residency whether he was doing enough, and that the answer he always came back to was that a man he'd never properly thanked had set a standard he spent his entire career trying to meet. A retired schoolteacher in Portland wrote a long essay for her local paper. She had been the driver of a bus following the Millbrook Road bus that afternoon. She had seen everything. She had spent 40 years carrying the image of a man running into smoke with no protective equipment, No training in civilian rescue. Nothing but whatever was in his chest that told him to go back in. She wrote, "I want him to know that what I saw that day was the truest thing I have ever seen a human being do. And I want to tell him that it was enough. What he gave us was enough. But we would still like the chance to say thank you." Thomas read all of it. Margaret gave him a private room and a laptop and let him read without interruption for most of a morning. When he came out, he sat down across from her and looked at his hands for a long moment. "I didn't know about most of these people," he said finally, "the things they went on to do." "No, you couldn't have." "There's a girl. There's a woman in Seattle who became a firefighter." He paused. "She was on the bus. She was 4 years old." Margaret waited. "She says she became a firefighter because of that day." He looked up. I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," Margaret said. "You just have to let them give it to you." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what you said, about whether to speak publicly." "What did you decide?" "I'll do one interview," he said. "One. And I want to see the questions before I agree to anything, and I want to be able to stop at any point, and I want it to be someone who isn't going to... I don't want it to be a spectacle." "I'll find the right person. And Diane's name will not appear anywhere," Margaret said firmly. "She's not part of the story. You are. The children are. That's where it stays." He nodded. Then, "I looked you up." She met his eyes. "The Lakeside Motor Inn," he said. "Your father was Gerald Holloway." She didn't look away. "Yes." "Carol loved that watercolor print. She talked about it for years. We went back once, about 5 years after our first visit. The motel had new owners by then. The print was gone." He paused. "Your father was kind to us. He was kind to a lot of people." "I know, but I mean it specifically." He looked at her steadily. "That weekend mattered to us, in ways I can't... It mattered. And I've been trying to figure out how to tell you that since you told me who you were." Margaret Holloway, who had not cried in a professional setting in over 2 decades, looked out the window at the Chicago skyline and breathed carefully for a moment. "Thank you," she said. The gathering happened on a Wednesday, 12 days after the story first broke. It had not been entirely Margaret's idea. The organization had emerged organically from the networks connecting Millbrook Road survivors, and her role had been largely to provide the venue and ensure that the logistics didn't collapse under the weight of their own momentum. By the time the day arrived, she had also provided more than the venue. Hotel rooms for those who had traveled significant distances, a private dining arrangement for Thomas and his daughter the evening before, and a substantial amount of behind-the-scenes coordination she had no intention of making public, because it was not about her. Diane had arrived the previous afternoon with a rolling suitcase and the wary composure of someone walking into something larger than they'd expected. She was quiet at dinner, and Thomas was careful with her, and Margaret sat at the end of the table and mostly listened to the two of them navigate the complicated terrain of a relationship that had nearly broken and was now, tentatively, beginning to reassemble itself. Diane had, Margaret learned over dinner, been accepted into an accelerated path for reinstating her CPA license through Illinois. A contact of Margaret's had helped facilitate the timing, though Margaret had arranged this through a third party because she didn't want it to feel like charity. It was simply a door being opened to a qualified person who had been blocked by circumstances that were, to a significant extent, not her fault. Diane had also been offered a contract accounting position with a small manufacturing firm in the Lakeview neighborhood. Independent of Margaret's network, this one, because Diane had found it herself. Thomas had not said anything about this during dinner, but twice Margaret caught him looking at his daughter with an expression she recognized from her own relationship with her father, the look of someone who has been afraid for long enough that relief still wears the mask of disbelief. The ballroom of the Grand Windsor held 400 people comfortably. On Wednesday morning it held 312, which was every survivor who had been able to make travel arrangements on 12 days' notice. They ranged in age from 44 to 56. They were teachers, nurses, engineers, lawyers, parents, a firefighter from Seattle, a pediatric oncologist from Houston, a high school football coach from rural Tennessee who had driven 14 hours and arrived with a hand-lettered sign that read, "We came back for you." They brought photographs of their own children and their own parents and their own lives, the evidence of everything that had happened after the smoke. Thomas stood at the entrance to the ballroom and looked at them for what seemed like a very long time before he walked in. What happened after that was not a press conference, though cameras were present. It was not a ceremony, though the structure of it had a ceremony's gravity. It was, more than anything else, a reunion between a man who had given everything he had on a September afternoon in Indiana and the people who had grown up to become the proof that it had mattered. They came to him one by one and in small groups. Some of them knew each other from previous anniversary events, and some were meeting for the first time, and most of them at some point held Thomas's hand or embraced him or simply stood near him and looked at him with the complicated expression of people confronting the full weight of a debt they know they can never fully repay. The pediatric oncologist from Houston, whose name was Karen Aldridge, stood in front of him and said, "I've saved 27 children with a particular type of liver tumor that was considered nearly untreatable 15 years ago. Those 27 children are alive because I went into medicine. I went into medicine because you went back into that bus." She paused. "I just needed you to know the math." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Thank you for that." The firefighter from Seattle, her name was Paula Novak, and she had her father's build and her mother's eyes, and she had been 4 years old when Thomas carried her out, handed him a photograph. It showed her in her gear, standing in front of her station, and on the back she had written a single sentence, "I know why I do this, it's because of you." Thomas held the photograph for a long time. Margaret watched from the side of the room. She had spent a career building things, structures, brands, systems, the complex architecture of hospitality that at its best creates spaces where people feel genuinely welcome. She had never built anything that looked like this. At some point the cameras found her, and the reporter she had agreed to work with. A veteran correspondent from a national network who had done this kind of thing with the gravity it required, brought a microphone to her and asked her what she wanted people to take from the story of Thomas Garrett. She thought about it genuinely, in the way she thought about everything, by considering what the true answer was, rather than what sounded best. "I want people to understand what it cost him," she said finally. "Not the day of the accident, that part he would tell you himself, was simple. You either go in or you don't, and he's not the kind of person who doesn't. But everything after. He turned down every opportunity to profit from what he did, because he thought that heroism shouldn't become a product. He spent everything he had on his wife. He's been walking across cities looking for his daughter. He's been doing this while sleeping on benches, and he has never once," she paused, "he has never once behaved like a man who feels the world owes him anything. And I would really like for the world to owe him something anyway." The correspondent asked what she was going to do to ensure that. "We've established a fund," she said, "the Thomas Garrett Foundation, which will support veterans experiencing housing instability. The initial endowment is coming from Holloway Hospitality, and we've already received commitments from 11 other organizations in the last 4 days. The fund is designed to provide not just emergency housing, but transition support, the kind of sustained help that actually changes outcomes rather than just moving people from one crisis to the next." She paused. "It's a start. It should have existed 40 years ago. A lot of things should have existed 40 years ago." The interview Thomas gave was 18 minutes long. He sat across from the correspondent in one of the hotel's smaller conference rooms, with no one else present except the camera operator and Margaret's communications director, who was there only to end the interview if Thomas asked her to. He had reviewed the questions. He had agreed to 12 of the original 17. He talked about Indiana in September, and about the way the smoke had a sound as well as a smell, and about the first child he reached, a boy named Danny Pierce, who was now a high school football coach in Tennessee, and who was, at that moment, approximately 40 yards away in a ballroom holding a hand-lettered sign. He talked about Carol, carefully and with obvious love and obvious grief, the two things existing simultaneously the way they do for people who have lost someone they didn't finish loving yet. He talked about Diane without using her name. He referred to her only as his daughter, and the correspondent, to her credit, did not push further. He talked about the bench outside the Grand Windsor Hotel. I want to be clear about this," he said. "I wasn't in trouble. I've been in trouble. I know the difference. I was tired. I'd been walking and I sat down and I was thinking about where to go next, and a woman came out of a car and gave me back something I'd dropped." He paused. "And then she asked me to come inside. Were you surprised?" He thought about this. "I was," he said, "but I think good things are still surprising. That probably shouldn't be the case, but it is." The correspondent asked him what he would say to people watching who had reached a point in their lives where they felt like what they'd given had been forgotten or hadn't mattered. Thomas was quiet for a moment. The camera held on his face, weathered and lined, entirely steady. "I'd say that the thing you did still happened," he said, "even if nobody else knows about it, even if you've stopped knowing about it yourself." He paused. "I spent a long time not thinking about Millbrook Road, not because I was ashamed of it or because it hurt. It did hurt, some of it, but that wasn't the reason. I stopped thinking about it because it was over. I did what I did and it was done, and then life went on and there were other things to do." He was quiet again. "But today I found out that a woman in Seattle became a firefighter because she was 4 years old on a bus in Indiana. I found out that a doctor in Houston has saved 27 children because she decided to go into medicine for a reason that started on that road." He looked at his hands. "The thing you do goes further than you can see. That's what I would tell them. It goes further than you can see." On the last evening of what Margaret had started privately calling the week that rearranged things, she sat with Thomas in the private lounge where they'd first talked. Diane was upstairs. She and Thomas had spent the afternoon together, walking along the lakefront in the October cold, and Margaret had given them the time and stayed out of their way entirely. They had come back looking like people who had walked far enough to say some of what needed saying, which was not all of it, but a beginning. Thomas had a glass of water in front of him. Margaret had coffee. "The foundation," he said. "I want to be involved. Not as a figurehead. I don't want to sit on a stage somewhere and smile for photographs. I mean actually involved. I know how to talk to veterans. I know what the actual problems are. I'd rather do the work than the optics." "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say," Margaret said. "I can't promise I'm not a smooth organizational type. I speak plainly. In my experience, organizations that need figureheads have something to hide. Organizations that need people who speak plainly are usually trying to actually do something." He looked at her steadily. "You remind me a little of Carol," he said. "She didn't suffer anything she considered unnecessary. I'm going to take that as a compliment. It was meant as one." They sat for a moment in the comfortable silence of people who have passed through something together and arrived at a place that is not the end, but is at least solid ground. "My father would have liked you," Margaret said. Thomas looked at her. "Tell me about him." So she did. She told him about Gerald Holloway, who had managed the Lakeside Motor Inn for 11 years and given discounted rooms to young couples in the rain and left the Chicago Tribune on the kitchen table on the morning after the accident because he thought his daughters should see what a man looks like when he decides not to walk away. She told him about the 3 daughters in the 2-bedroom apartment in Evanston and about the first hotel she'd opened in her early 30s when the bank called it reckless and her father called it exactly right. She told him that she had been sitting in the back of a limousine on Michigan Avenue in the rain thinking about a board meeting, and she had seen a man on a bench, and she had done something that Gerald Holloway would have called obvious. Thomas listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like someone who understood that the small things aren't actually small," he said. "That's exactly right. That's exactly what he understood." "I think," Thomas said slowly, "that I have been sitting on that bench in one form or another for a long time, not just outside your hotel, for years. And I convinced myself that sitting there was a kind of dignity, that not asking for anything was the same as not needing anything." He paused. "I'm starting to think those are different things." "They're completely different things," Margaret said. "Yeah." He looked at his hands again, then at her. "Thank you for coming out of the car. Thank you for not arguing about coming inside." He almost smiled. Then he did smile. a real one this time, the kind that changes a face. And Margaret Holloway looked at it and thought about her father, and about the lakeside motor inn, and about the watercolor print that had been gone by the time Thomas and Carol went back, and about all the invisible threads that run between people without their knowledge, connecting them across decades and decisions they never knew were related, until one rainy afternoon in October, everything becomes visible at once, and you understand that the world is smaller and more intricate and more alive with consequence than you ever had time to notice. Outside the windows of the Grand Windsor, Chicago, the city went on doing what cities do, moving and lit and indifferent to any particular story, carrying millions of individual lives through the dark in all their ordinary and extraordinary dimensions. Somewhere in the Lakeview neighborhood, a manufacturing firm had a start date on a calendar. Somewhere in Seattle, a woman in firefighter gear was telling her crew about a week that had changed something for her. In Houston and Columbus and Portland and Tennessee and 23 other states, people were looking at photographs they'd kept for 40 years and feeling something that was equal parts gratitude and relief, and the particular joy of a debt you finally had the chance to repay. And in a private lounge off the lobby of a Chicago hotel, two people sat with their coffee and their water and their accumulated years and talked about what came next, which was everything. If this story reached you, if you found something in Thomas's quiet dignity that made you sit up a little straighter, if you thought about someone in your own life who deserved to be found, if you wondered whether the things you've given without recognition are still out there doing work you can't see, then stay with that feeling for a moment before you go. Stories like this exist because human beings are capable of the thing Thomas did, and not just in burning fields on Indiana roads. They happen in hospitals, in classrooms, in kitchens, in 3-minute phone calls that someone takes at 11 o'clock at night because a person they love needs to hear a voice. The math Karen Aldridge did, standing in a hotel ballroom, your math is out there too. It's going further than you can see. And if someone you know is sitting on a bench right now, in whatever form that takes in their life, maybe the thing to do is go out of the car.